I'm Suzan Alteri, and I'm here with Dr. Robert Egolf on April 22nd, 2019, to do an oral history here in Ocala, Florida. Could you tell me a little bit about your family background?
Well, I was born and raised in a little town in Pennsylvania, Somerset. Went to Yale University undergraduate, Temple Medical School, and practiced general medicine 25 years in Brooksville, Florida.
What was Somerset like as a town? You said it was kind of small?
It was a county seat town. In those days, of course, the town closed down on Sundays. There were no retail stores open of any kind. The farmers came to town on Saturday evening to do their shopping for the week. It was a kind of place where your mother would turn you out at early in the morning in the Sunday or in the summer, and you'd be going all day and she wouldn't have to worry about you.
What was that like? What did you do when you went outside all day? Did you go outside a lot?
I wasn't too much of an outside person. I rode my bike a good bit, but my idea of a good day was to curl up in a big leather armchair in our living room and read books. So I started from an early age.
Yeah. Did you have a favorite that you used to like to read, or a topic that you used to like to read?
When my mother would take me shopping in our little downtown section, if I was good, she'd buy me a 10-cent Big Little book. So I had a bushel basket full of Big Little books that I poured over regularly.
Yeah. Were they mostly from comics, or were they other ones?
Mostly a lot of Mickey Mouse in those days.
Yeah. What did your father do for a living?
Up until the Second World War, my father was an automobile dealer. He had the Buick agency in Somerset. When the Second World War came along, he didn't see how he was going to make a living selling used cars or new cars when there weren't going to be any new cars to sell. So he sold his dealership and started a small loans business.
Did you have any siblings growing up?
I had an older sister, nine years older than me. She said that it was really like having two only children because we were so far apart in years. My sister said she got the years when my father started out as a farm boy. He worked a few years in the mines, worked construction. My father claims he got his real start by he was working construction in Johnstown, Pennsylvania as a laborer. And the foreman came to work one day and said, "Can any of you guys read a blueprint?" My father had never seen a blueprint in his life, but he thought this was his chance, so he put up his hand and said, "I can read blueprints." And he went on from there.
That's a great story.
We didn't really know that the Depression existed in my family. We always had food on the table. The times were very good for me when I was a little boy.
What was school like? Did you enjoy it?
Well, I went into the medical profession, but it was never really something that I picked because my family knew I was going to be a doctor from the day I came into the world. I guess they were fortunate that I was able to do it. But my father sent me to Wade private school my senior year in high school because he thought that would look good in my resume. And it's kind of a funny story. I was going to go to Franklin and Marshall College from prep school, Mercersburg Academy in which is close to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And one day towards the end of my senior year, the dean of academics called me and said, Egolf, he said, where are you going to go to school? I said, well, I'm thinking about Franklin or Marshall. He said, Egolf, he says, this school lives on the graduates it sends to Yale, Harvard, or Princeton. Now take your choice. So I put in an application to Yale. That was the only college application I sent in, believe it or not, and got accepted at Yale, fortunately.
What was it like at Yale?
Well, I don't think there's been too much change in the approach at Yale since I've been there. We were exposed to a lot of people coming in to give lectures. William Sloane Coffin was very prominent in the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, I guess, was our chaplain. It was a different experience for me because I was from a small town, was very naive, I think, about the ways of a big city, but I enjoyed myself.
Did you belong to any of the clubs or anything at Yale?
No, Yale has about half dozen or fewer fraternities, and they all have about 20 or 30 members. It's very to emphasize there's not a big Greek presence on the Yale campus at all. In those days, the secret societies here, like Skull and Bones, for example, they had a cattle call in the middle of the freshman quadrangle once a year, and you were tapped if you were going to be asked to join a secret society. I didn't even bother going. I knew that I was not prominent enough in anything to be tapped for a secret society. And you didn't hear much about them because they were, of course, they were very secretive.
Did you have a favorite professor?
I don't think so. Being in a pre-med course, I had laboratories most afternoons, so we always felt kind of picked on because we'd go to the zoology course, for example, you go to 3 hours of lectures and then have a full afternoon's lab and get the same amount of credits as a English major that just didn't have any laboratories at all.
So yeah, you guys spent mostly all day in school then, really.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Is this where you met your wife?
No, I met her in kindergarten. Seriously, we went to, we were the same age. We went to school together from kindergarten through junior year in high school. And then we didn't see each other for 50 years. And I was playing bridge at the Ocala Bridge Club one day, and this strange pair of ladies sat down opposite us to play us, and she looked at my name badge. I happened to be wearing my name badge that day, which was unusual because I usually didn't bother putting it on. She said, Somerset High School, class of 1951. And I was dumbstruck, of course. And so she had told me who she was, and she knew who I was. And we got together, and we've been together ever since. 14 years now, right?
So when you were practicing medicine, you were a general practitioner?
Yes.
Yeah. What did you have a favorite thing about practicing medicine, or?
Well, I enjoyed the contact with patients. But as I got older, the role of the government in medical practice became more and more prominent. And I did not enjoy my interactions with the federal government. So when I turned 65, I retired the day I turned 65. And I was practicing in Brooksville, and I knew that I couldn't retire in the community I'd practiced in for 25 years. Your patient won't allow it.
Yeah.
So my wife at that time looked around. We thought we were going to move to Gainesville. As a matter of fact, we put a bid in on the house in Gainesville, in the old historic district in Gainesville, and we were beat to it by one day. I think whoever the state senator was from Gainesville at that time bought the house, so he'd put a bid on. And we liked the Episcopal Church in Ocala. So I thought, well, Ocala is just a short drive from Gainesville. If I want to use the library at Gainesville or monitor any courses or do that sort of thing, I can do it from Ocala, which is why we picked Ocala to live.
Did you go up to the university a lot?
Not as much as I thought I might. But there was a lot to do in Ocala. We had a senior learning center at College of Central Florida, I guess it is now. It was Ocala Junior College when we moved here. I moved to Ocala in 1994.
Have you seen it change a lot since you first moved?
Oh, yeah. The road that you drove on from the interstate out here, Route 200, that was a 2-lane country road when I moved to Ocala. And the year I moved here in 94 was an El Nino year, and we had rain. We had 13 inches of rain in Ocala in December that first year I was here. And there were things underwater that I haven't seen underwater since 94, 20-some years.
Well, I saw in one of the articles that you also had been in Key West during Hurricane Donna.
Yes. Hurricane Donna convinced me that practicing in a town with one road coming in and out, and we were 3 weeks without any water because our water came down over the bridges across the Keys. And to try to run a hospital when they turn the water on for 1 hour a day is very difficult. So what do you do if there's emergency surgery, or
right?
How do you launder the sheets and all the things that get dirty in a hospital? It was a real mess.
But it didn't turn you off from Florida, huh?
Oh, no. No, I was convinced I was going to stay in Florida. So I moved from Key West, and I took up a job with the University of South Florida. The year I went to work for the University of South Florida was their first class graduated. Dr. John Allen was president of the University of South Florida at that time. And there's been a lot of changes in that school, too. I was there 10 years as the director of the Student Health Services. Dr. Allen thought that the University of South Florida was going to be strictly a commuter university, and he didn't want any major athletics, no football team, for example. And I think it's changed quite a bit since Dr. John Allen's day.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest universities, I think, now, too.
Well, second to University of Central Florida in Orlando.
Yeah. The 10 years you were there, though, was there a lot of historical events happened during that time. What was it like being on a college campus during the 60s?
Well, we graduated our charter class the year I went there. That would have been about 1962. And Dr. Allen used to joke, he said that South Florida is a school in which the cement never sets. And that was right. They were building constantly while I was there. including dormitories.
So even right from the beginning, they thought students would stay over.
Yes. Although the first 10 years, we still had a huge commuter population. I think that our commuting population was bigger than our resident population during the entire time I was there.
What made you decide to go into private practice you went after working at the University of South Florida?
Well, I was working weekends in various emergency rooms to supplement my income. And I'd been working in the emergency room in Brooksville, Florida, a number of occasions. And I knew the doctors there, and I knew the hospital. And I liked the idea of a small town. I didn't care for working in a big city.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any children during this time, or?
2. I had a boy and a girl. Uh-huh. My daughter is since deceased. She died with multiple myeloma about 4 years ago now, Dolores. We just had a visit from my son. My son lives in North Carolina, a place called Spruce Pine, which is close to Boone, I think, 20 miles from the Tennessee border.
Mm-hmm. What does your son do?
He's retired.
So were you collecting books at this time also, or did that?
Well, as I said, I had a lifelong interest in books, but not collecting in any field or for any particular reason, just buying books to read. And you want me to tell the story about the Bookends?
You can if you want. I think it's a great story.
We'd acquired somewhere a pair of brass frogs. I think this library has those brass frogs now. Didn't I give them to the library?
Yeah.
And I looked at those brass frogs' bookends. They were sitting on their haunches with their front feet up like this against the books. I thought, wouldn't it be a clever idea to have some children's books between those brass frog bookends? So I went to Walden Books. I don't think Walden Books is in existence anymore, is it?
No, but I remember Walden Books.
It used to be in every mall. And I bought a number of picture books. I was particularly drawn to picture books for some reason. I don't know exactly why, but I was. And one thing led to another, and I started looking in the to see whether they were first editions or not, and first printings, first editions, and my interest just went on from there.
Were the children's books the first area you started collecting in, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was children's book collecting was in a very primitive state in those days. There was no such thing as the internet, of course. This is the early 80s I'm talking about now, 83, 84. Book collecting depended on, if you wanted to get particular books that you had your eye on, depended on cultivating personal relationships with the few dealers that existed in those days for children's books. Justin Schiller in New York City, Helen Younger at Aleph Books, they're both still working, I think. And so you'd go to New York and spend a weekend with the dealers, and you'd keep want lists of your books with all the people that were dealing with children's books. There was a lady out in California I did a good bit of business with, although she was not an antiquarian book dealer. And later on, there was a lady in Washington, D.C. that had a very good inventory. And it was through personal relationships that you actually were able to form your collection. I know that Helen at Aleph always sent me her catalog 3 days before she sent it out to anyone else so that I'd get my pick of what I wanted out of her catalog. I got my first computer in about 83 or 84 specifically to keep track of my children's book collection. In those days, of course, there was no internet. When you bought a computer, you had to deal with DOS.
Yeah, what was that like?
It was difficult.
So did you build like a database on your own? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think my first computer had 25 megabytes of hard drive. That's megabytes, not kidding. Nowadays, I don't even look at a laptop unless it has at least a terabyte.
That's right. What do you remember as sort of the first book that, do you remember the first book that you bought that you were really glad you got it first?
Well, I think the book that really convinced me to go into collecting children's books was a book by Barbara Bader called American Picture Books from Noah's Ark to the Beast Within. Mm-hmm. And I bought that book and read it, and I decided I was going to try to collect all of the books that she had illustrated in her book. And I think I ended up with all but 30 or 40 of those books. And then I decided I was going to collect Caldecott books, honors books, and the medal books, of course. And eventually I had a complete set of Caldecott books from 1938, which was Animals of the Bible. That was the first Caldecott medal book. Complete through to 84 or 85 and maybe beyond, probably up to 90, the early 90s, my collection was complete. And that's in first editions, first printings. Now, there were some that I just never was lucky enough to latch onto. Robert McCloskey's book, Make Way for Ducklings, for example. I had a third printing of that book, which came out 3 months after the first printing, but I was never able to get any closer to a first printing of that book. And I never did find a Where the Wild Things Are, Maurice Sendak's medal winner, in Dust Jacket. It just didn't exist in Dust Jacket. Although it does now, but the prices on the internet for Where the Wild Things Are in its original Dust Jacket is astronomical. I think $16,000 or $18,000 the last time I checked.
Yeah, I found a copy of, I don't know if you remember Pat the Bunny children's book.
Yes,
A first edition was $9,000.
Even some of the books that most people have never heard about, Little House by Virginia Lee Burton, for example. I looked at it the other day on the internet, $20,000 for a first printing in Dust Jacket. Incidentally, I'm a little disappointed in the online catalog that the University of Florida Library has, because they don't include any bibliographic information on the catalog information. No notion as to whether it's a first printing or a third or a fourth printing. Not even whether the book is in Dust Jacket or not. And for all of these books, especially modern editions, Dust Jackets are crucial.
It is important. Yeah, that's something I can definitely speak to cataloging about, because a lot of them that we purchase now too don't always have the Dust Jacket. It just, kind of depends. But yeah, that's something we can definitely have added. I don't know why they didn't add that in, actually, because for picture books, it's very important. I mean, it's a part of the book, especially.
Yeah, and for books in Dust Jacket, even when you're digitalizing them, it's important to have the front and the back flap of the Dust Jacket.
Yeah, it is.
Part of the digitalization process. And I think it would increase the use of the library to have that bibliographic information on the
Yeah, it would. It's important when people come and do research. I know just from talking to patrons too that they often want to know if a book's in a dust jacket or if we have the dust jacket somewhere. The sad thing is especially with children's books, when they come into libraries, they usually throw the dust jacket away at like the public library of those places.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The library copies are usually first editions because they get the books when they first come out.
Yeah.
But on the for the book collector, for some reason, having a library stamp in a book destroys its value by about 50%, I'd say, at least.
Did you were you aware of other children's book collectors at the time you started collecting?
I was not aware of other collectors. As I said, I knew most of the dealers that dealt in children's books, but and I don't think there were very many collectors of children's books when I was collecting. That would be between about 83 and 95, say. And the prices reflected it. Yeah. You could pick up children's books, except the very most prominent ones. For example, Alice in Wonderland, the first edition, would have been expensive. But books were not terribly expensive when I was collecting. I think the most I ever paid for a book was like $3,500. And that was a first edition Wizard of Oz. And I think I paid $1,500 for a first edition of Peter Rabbit, Beatrix Potter's book. Mm. But when we traveled, I'd go into all the antique stores, and some of them would have children's books. I went into a secondhand bookstore in Erie, Pennsylvania, that had a section that devoted to older books. And of all things, I found on the shelf a copy of Peter Parley's Tales About America. That book was published in 1812, but the book that I found in that bookstore was 1813, which was probably a second printing or a second edition. But there were 6 known copies of Peter Parley's Tales About America known at the time, and the second edition was rarer than the first edition. So I'm sure there were fewer than 10 known copies of that book, and I paid $9 for it.
Did you know it when you saw it? Were you like?
Well, I knew Peter Parley's Tales About America was an uncommon book. And it was in pieces. It was complete, but it was in pieces. The back and front covers were detached. They were present but detached, so I had to take it to a bookbinder and have it put back together again.
Did it cost more to have it repaired than what you paid for?
Yes. And to put it into a cylinder case, yeah, it was more expensive. So you lucked onto things like that occasionally. And I went into an antique store in Mobile, Alabama, and I found a whole shelf of children's books. It was in an antique mall, so the dealer wasn't there that day. But the people that were there, that were the dealers, other dealers that were around that stall, didn't want the person to lose their sale, so they said, well, take whatever you want and we'll charge you $1 a piece for them. So I went through this large stack of books and picked out probably 24 books that were first printings, first editions, and paid $1 for them, $1 a piece for them. I was in a store in Akron, Ohio that had a huge stack of back issues of Life magazine. And I was looking for a Dr. Seuss advertisement that was pictured in Barbara Bader's book. Didn't find that one, but I found about 10 or a dozen Life magazines with advertisements that have been done by Dr. Seuss for I guess, Flit, which is an insecticide spray. And so I bought those magazines, and I think the university has those in my collection now.
Yeah. What you said that collecting children's books was the first area you collected in. What drew you to history of science and church history as areas to collect in?
Say it again. I'm sorry, I missed the question.
What drew you to expanding when you collected into science and religion?
Oh. Well, it's hard to say. Religion is another area of book collecting that doesn't really receive its due, I think. Books on religion are inexpensive. I just bought a copy of Eusebius' History of the Church for several $100s, and it's an edition that was published in 1613. So 17th century books are inexpensive, comparatively speaking, in the field of religion. And of course, in the 17th century, most publishing was devoted to books on religion. Now, if you go to the really famous book, if you go to Isaac Newton's Principia or books of that nature, they're fantastically expensive, but for the most part, 17th century books on religion are inexpensive, comparatively speaking.
Did you have a certain area in religion that you focused on?
Yes, the history of the Episcopal Church. But my interest in religious books extends to a lot of areas of modern scholarship. For example, the synoptic problem, which gospel was written first and which are dependent on the others. The interface between religion and science is of particular interest to me. The quest for the historical Jesus is a 19th century preoccupation. So I have those books as well as a lot of books on the history of the Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of stuff written for children, of course, that was religious too.
Well, up until the late 18th century, children's books were didactic in nature, purely didactic. I don't think that children were perceived of as being children until the Victorian age, actually. Yeah. So that you have a lot of early books that deal with the dying children and their death scenes and so on, and really depressing things of that nature. I never got into that area of children's books. I tried to cut my collecting off at the early 1800s.
For religion or for children?
No, the children's books I'm speaking of now.
Yeah. Was there, as you said, in the was there much competition as you moved into history of science for the books you collected?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to know how much competition there is because nowadays book collecting consists of going to AB Books or Amazon and seeing what's available and taking your choice. And it's made book collecting completely different.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the differences that you see between book collecting now versus when you started?
Well, the price of books, for one thing. The things were incredibly cheap back in the 80s. But the major difference is that the book dealers, the antiquarian book dealers, very rarely don't list everything they have available on the internet, and you can just and you have your choice of a wide variety of prices and conditions and so on. So it's an armchair hobby now, which is fortunate for me, because if I had to do all the traveling that I did when I was younger in the 80s and 90s collecting books, it would be a different proposition entirely.
Do you still have connections with dealers that you used to deal with, though?
Very seldom. I've heard from Helen Younger occasionally. She's at Alphabet. I think maybe the University of Florida, I think, contacted her when they were considering taking my children's book collection, and she said, "You're getting a good set of books. Most of them have gone through my hands," she said. That's right, I was a good customer. I made it a point never to argue about price with a book dealer. I paid what they asked, there were no questions asked. And I think I only ever returned one book to a dealer because the condition didn't satisfy me. That was over a course of 10 or more years and a couple thousand books.
What made you decide that you wanted to give the collection to the university?
Well, I knew about the Baldwin Collection, and I decided that was a good home for my collection. I wanted to preserve it intact. So I went up and saw, who was the lady I spoke with? Smith.
Rita
Smith, yes. I walked into her office more or less unannounced, and I had a briefcase with me, and I pulled out Peter Parley's Tales About America, a first edition of Huckleberry Finn, a first edition of Peter Rabbit, a first edition of The Wizard of Oz. I think I had Nathaniel Hawthorne's Wonder Book and an Uncle Remus first edition. And I said, I'd like to give my collection to the university. And Rita's eyes kind of widened out when she saw what I had in my briefcase, naturally. And so she came down very shortly thereafter and looked at my entire collection and decided that it would just fit in perfectly with the Baldwin collection, which it does. It brings the Baldwin collection up to date, up to the 90s at least.
Yeah, it does, because Ruth had never collected after really 1900. She didn't really want to.
And Ruth Baldwin had a different style of collecting. I understand from Rita that what Ruth Baldwin did, she'd buy an entire used bookstore out and then sort out the books that she wanted from the bookstore's wares inventory and sell the rest.
Yep. One of Ruth's favorite things to do was to stop a catalog, so she would buy the whole thing and then nobody else could buy anything. Right.
And Ruth was kind of funny about her collection. She didn't care much to have people looking at it for some reason. I never understood what her reasoning was, but she was very close-minded about who had access to those books.
Did you ever meet her or no?
No, she was still living, I think, in 83 or 84, but no, I never met Ruth Baldwin. But of course, Rita had known her very well.
So moving into your sort of history of science collection, could you tell me a little bit about it?
About what?
Your history, the science books you collected?
Oh, yeah. I'd always been interested in biology, of course, being a zoology major in college, and particularly evolution and the interface of evolution with religion. So I decided I'd collect as much as I could about the interface of evolutionary theory, beginning with Charles Darwin, of course, and religion. And it's the interface of science with religion has been a little bit misrepresented in the history books. It's been represented as warfare. Alexander Dixon White's book, The Warfare of Science with Religion, and William Draper's book that was mainly an anti-Catholic screed, but and those are both books in my collection. Presented it as a issue of warfare, and Thomas H. Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, was interested in establishing scientists on a more secure basis. Up until the Victorian age in England, science was the province of aristocratic amateurs, and Thomas H. Huxley was interested in establishing scientists as a profession on their own, and he was an agnostic, militant agnostic, and he furthered this idea of warfare between science and religion. But modern historians of science and religion think that it was more of a cooperative effort with some points of friction. And it's a much more nuanced story than we've been led to think.
Well, Darwin was religious, wasn't he? A little bit.
Darwin died as an agnostic, but he gravitated away from religion when his 11-year-old daughter died. He lost that daughter who was the apple of his eye, and he did not understand how a merciful God could do that. And there have been rumors circulated that have been proven mostly false that he had a deathbed conversion back to Christianity, but that's not true.
Do you have any, in terms of the science books you've collected and about sort of evolution, were there certain books that you bought that you are especially proud you managed to get?
Well, as part of my collection on evolution, I also included the creationists and the anti-evolutionists, and I have a lot of those books. I have William Jennings Bryan's book that was published in 1924, for example, and the pamphlet that he circulated, it's a chapter 4 of his book. And there were some evolutionists who were good scientists, but were also good Roman Catholic. Maybe St. George Mivart was one of them. He was really conflicted in his conscience about how to resolve his Roman Catholicism and his evolutionary understandings. So a lot of that creationist literature is included in my books on the history of science and evolution.
And that's not something I think you tend to see as well represented in probably science collections.
Yes, there's a book on geology that I looked for several years and couldn't find. Finally found a copy of it. New Geology. I forget the man's name who wrote it. I haven't looked at those books for a long time now. But yeah, some of the early anti-evolutionary literature is extremely uncommon. There was a theologian at Princeton by the name of Charles Hodge who wrote a book. His quotation is famous. He says, "Evolution is nothing but atheism." And I finally found a copy of his book. I have Charles Hodge's book on evolution.
When you were collecting a lot, what methods did you use to collect? Was it mostly going through catalogs and sending a want list, or?
In the 80s and early 90s, yes, it was going through catalogs. It was through keeping want lists at all of the dealers that might have the books, come into possession of the books I had, and letting them know what I wanted. For example, there was a book illustrated in Barbara Bader's book, a Russian book on the Three Bears. And a dealer that I was in pretty much contact with happened to see it lying on a table next to hers at a book fair she went to. So she bought it, of course, knowing that I wanted it. And that's how that book came into my collection. It was a matter of correspondence and diligence and going into used bookstores and antique stores and looking for books. Nowadays, it's just your laptop and the internet.
Do you have advice if someone was to just get started collecting books today? What do you think would be the most important things they should know?
Well, when you're collecting books of anything, I think condition is the number one issue. The more you pay for a book, the more likely it is to increase in value. If you buy a cheap book, it's never going to increase in value. And while if you're not interested in turning your collection into money, and I never have been interested in turning it into money, it's a matter of condition and rarity and what you're interested in. If you're not interested in the books you're collecting, you're in the subject matter, that is, you're not going to be able to devote the time to it that's necessary. And my advice to book collectors is keep track of your books. In other words, when you acquire a book, note down who you bought it from, the price you paid, the date you bought it. And those things will all be important later on.
Well, I think that's about all the questions we had. Are there other things you?
No, I don't think so. I think I pretty much covered it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.